What's the point? Well, it's a cross between Yellow Submarine and The Phantom Tollbooth. It's a kids' movie, mostly, made for television in 1971 by the musician Harry Nilsson, and released alongside an album of the same name, The Point! Exclamation point. Harry Nilsson apparently came up with the idea for this movie while he was tripping on acid in a forest. It shows a little bit. Now, if you were lucky enough to see this when it was first broadcast on television, I think this was some kind of landmark. By the way, maybe the first full-length animated film broadcast on American television, something like that. You can look it up. The exact significance. If you saw the original broadcast, then you would have heard the story narrated by Dustin Hoffman, who plays a father in a framing story and then narrates the story that the father reads to his son. Later on, the narration would be re-recorded by Alan Barsman and then by Alan Thicke. And then for the VHS release, which is maybe the most well-known version, it's the version I watched, the narration was done one more time by none other than Richard Starkey, also known as Ringo Starr. We'll talk about the different narrators shortly. The Point is the story of Oblio, a child born in the Pointed City, a city where everything has a point. And by point, I mean like this. In this movie, we're going to see a couple different meanings of point. There's the topological meaning, although mathematically a point is just an exact location with no size. What we're talking about here is a cone, really. And I think there is a point at the top of the cone, the vertex or the apex, but that isn't quite as catchy, I guess. Anyway, we have this mathematical topological point, which defines the pointed city. Everything is sharp, pointy. You'd hate to fall down there. We also have an intellectual point, the meaning of something, the point of a story, something a bit didactic. I guess you could subdivide this even more into sort of really like a moral, didactic point that the story's trying to prove, and more a general, more nuanced point of a story. Anyway, there's also point as in purpose, or telos, if you want a fancier word, raison d'etre. My French, not so good. The point of my life is to make these videos. Thankfully, it isn't. The point of your life is to watch these videos. Again, thankfully not. But point, right, as in purpose. The movie is going to switch between these different types of points. And the story is relatively straightforward. Oblio is born in the pointed city where the law of the land is that everything and everyone must have a point. But, shockingly, scandalously, he has no point, as in, and it's sort of assumed that he also has no point in either of the other two senses. Before too long, a conniving count banishes him from the city. After all, he is violating the law of the land. You had one job, which was to have a point, and he couldn't do that. He banishes him from the pointed city to the pointless forest. Oblio wanders through the pointless forest with his dog, Arrow, and before too long realizes that there's really very few things in life with absolutely no point. Besides, of course, these videos. So, like I said, we start out thinking mainly about topological points, and we come to see other type of points. Other types of points that are just as pointy as the physical ones, just as important, perhaps more important, right? Rather than looking the part, fitting in superficially, seeming a certain way, we come to see that maybe a point can be something deeper. A point can have a deeper meaning. Maybe deeper meaning is the point. So already you can probably see some ways in which this is a nice children's story, and maybe some ways in which this is a story that fits 1971. Oblio, an outsider, is initially forced out. He goes on a voyage of discovery, a rather psychedelic voyage of discovery where he flirts with nonsense. Reminds me a bit of Alice in Wonderland in some places. And where he ultimately learns to love in himself. To love in himself. Jeez. To love himself, to believe in himself. Oblio is banished by a tribunal initially. There don't seem to be three people on this tribunal, more just one, the king. The Count is the main antagonist. He campaigns quite actively for banishment, citing how Oblio, without a point, is in clear violation of the law of the land. There's a gentle king, a figurehead seemingly, who reluctantly accepts this argument and banishes Oblio. It is the law, after all, and we've got to follow the law, apparently. This isn't exactly a revolutionary story. The king is actually a good guy. Revolutionary story. I mean, it's not exactly a story of revolution. They're not going to topple the monarchy or the government. They're not going to tear down the palace. The king is a good guy. He regrets sending Oblio away. The problem is that there's a bad seed lower down in government who manipulates the king. This is a fairly common plot line in children's stories. Not that the whole system is broken, but that there's some bad, there's just some malicious, evil, malevolent force somewhere. Some corruption of an overall sound system and structure. It's interesting. Usually this is in a context of a monarchy, right? Why is this so common? Maybe because a lot of classic children's stories come from countries that have or had monarchies, where the crown is seen as a benevolent figurehead, i.e. England. Of course, this movie is American. It'd be interesting to look more into this children's monarchy thing. Why is so much of children's literature stuck in the feudal age? I don't really know. You can look at it too. You look at Disney. I mean, Disney princesses. Why do people have any interest in their kids thinking of themselves as part of this system, thinking of themselves as princes and princesses? It's a totally ahistorical viewpoint that doesn't really make any sense, but hey, people make a lot of money off of this. A question for another time, but like I said, why is so much children's literature stuck in the feudal age? Anyway, like I said, it's the Count who gets Oblio kicked out. He likens Oblio's roundness to madness. And while the arguments are cast as a bit outlandish, I think there is something deeper to them. They do touch on something real, which is people's fear of instability. The Count builds a case that's kind of existential in some ways. You know, Oblio, just this kid running around without a point, what's he doing to harm anyone else? He's not hurting anyone, is he? He's not crashing his car into people. He's not stealing. He's not lying. He's not deceiving. So what's the problem? Well, somehow the Count seems to pitch that Oblio, without a point, endangers everyone else. That he threatens to put a hole in the boat that this whole society is sailing in, right? That he's going to break down some sense of identity of the city, that he's going to break down binaries that people depend on, break down systems of meaning that people depend on. In some ways, this sort of like xenophobia or whatever, or just fear of change, these things are really simple, but on another level, they're interesting because they don't really make that much sense, and yet they have defined huge portions of cultural, social conflict. And you can see why this kind of storyline, banishing the outsider, banishing this person who looks different, who isn't hurting anyone directly, but who makes people afraid for some reason, makes people think that the system's going to come crumbling down just because he's in the room, right? You can see how this maybe resonated with people in 1971. Still resonates. At first, you know, the people, the citizens, the pointy citizens of the pointed city kind of go for this. Well, it's the law, after all, they say. The citizens of the pointed city have a real understated nature in this movie. We get a number of scenes where they're discussing the day-to-day happenings, where they're shuffling about, discussing the weather, the goings-on. And we get some reflections on the verdict, too. Okay, some people think it's a bit harsh, but also it's the law. What are you going to do? Some of these people sound a bit like Rodney Dangerfield. It's kind of a 1950s America vibe. They're shuffling it back and forth, discussing the weather. They're boring, in other words. This is another sort of framing that's, I think, common in children's stories, but also common at that type of time, is the adults being boring and the children having some sort of inspiration, having some sort of imagination that should not be stifled but should be grown, empowered. Interesting. In the Dustin Hoffman version, the narrator has a similar kind of understated vibe. He's actually, in some ways, the father in the framing novel, or in the framing, in the frame, who's reading the story to the son, has a similar kind of characteristic to a lot of the adults in the story, which is interesting because they aren't quite aligned. I mean, Dustin, or the father, sort of pitches this book as something cool that you should read, but presumably if he likes the book, then he must agree with the moral of the book, which is that you shouldn't kick out Oblio. And so he wouldn't be as understated about these people. He wouldn't be as understated as the citizens of the city in the story, who aren't exactly on board with it, but don't really object to him leaving, at least not at first. So in some ways they're different, but in other ways they're kind of similar in that they're both very boring. Dustin Hoffman's version is sort of this neurotic, boring adult, I think. Now, I guess he's cool enough to want to read his child a book, so maybe he's not so boring in that sense. But here we lean in a little bit more to this generational thing, to kids are interesting. And we see a little bit less of a suggestion that the boring nature is directly the result of being pointy, right? Because the non-pointy dad is in the same position. Okay. This is basically just boring adulthood as a contrast across the board to Oblio, who is earnest and sincere, and all the vivid and interesting people he meets in the pointless forest. Now, in the Ringo version, things are a little bit different, because Ringo is cool, right? Ringo was friends with Harry Nilsson, which is presumably why he ended up with this role. It's kind of interesting that Ringo plays the dad. Dustin Hoffman is maybe a more natural fit as a dad at 71, maybe not, I don't know. But Ringo certainly is maybe a little bit more youthful and cool than you would expect. Why is the dad youthful, right? Well, Dustin Hoffman might play more into the generational thing. Ringo gives us something a little bit different, frames the story a little bit more moralistically, maybe. Now, to be honest, I only watched a few scenes of the Dustin Hoffman version, so I don't want to jump to too many conclusions here. What I'll say is that the Ringo version is good. I think that really Ringo has more charisma than Hoffman in his reading, and he really sets up kind of both because of who he was and because of the way it's read, there's kind of a moral context that is laid down here that I think strengthens the movie. By the way, Ringo was also the original narrator for Thomas the Tank Engine, a television series that I hope to review soon on this channel. Before we get too far down the road, talk a little bit more about the frame here, right? In some ways, this frame isn't exactly necessary. So it's a father reading the story to his son. And it's possible this is mainly to accommodate commercial breaks. We jump back to the frame a couple times, and at first I was like, why? What's the point? But maybe that was for TV. Remember, this was made for television. Now, interestingly, the dad actually laments that kids these days in 1971 are only interested in watching their programs, that they don't care about stories anymore. They just want to watch TV. And it seems like what we're going to see is the kid become engrossed in the story and forget about his program, forget about the TV. This is more or less what happens, but oddly enough, the first transition to the story takes us through the TV screen. We're in the bedroom and we sort of zoom through the television screen and we're in the story, as if the story is what's on television. This gives us kind of a more sympathetic view of television and kind of contradicts everything that Ringo had just said, kids, are sabotaged. Their imaginations are sabotaged by the television. Probably they just put this in there because they thought it was a cool transition. Maybe, since this is a television movie, they thought they should water down the anti-TV rhetoric a bit. I don't know. Anyway, we go through the television and we're introduced to the Pointed City. Nothing really happens before we get a song. This is a musical, remember, and there's a lot of music in this movie. Overall, the music is cool. Some of the songs, like Me and My Arrow, are really good, actually. This is probably the most famous song from the movie and from the album. This song appears in an episode of The Simpsons. Maybe you've seen. It's from season 24. I think so. Not one of the most famous ones. But I remember first becoming aware of Harry Nilsson, I think, from having seen that episode and looking up the song. Anyway, Me and My Arrow. Worth noting, by the way, Arrow, great name for a dog, and also ties in a little bit to our topological ideas. An arrow certainly has a point, albeit it might be a point that goes this way and then darts back this way and goes back this way, a point that gets distracted by a ball every once in a while. The animation in this movie is pretty cool. The opening scenes of the family are really simple, almost like some kind of hand-drawn Saturday cartoon, or maybe like something you'd see scratched with a Sharpie onto the inside of an outhouse or something. This has a hand-drawn feel, without a doubt. Part of the movie, I guess, looks maybe like it's pulled from children's drawings. When we go to the Pointed City, things are more vivid. And when we go to the Pointed City, or when we go to the Pointless Forest, this is when the illustrations are really at their peak. There's some pretty cool imagery. The animation is a vibe. That said, it does look old. You can see all kinds of shortcuts in the animation. Places where it is a bit static. Places where it is a bit sparse. A lot of frames with a lot of empty space. So like I said, the animation is pretty cool, but it definitely looks old. In general, I'm not sure how a kid today would react to this movie, actually. Compared to other sort of new animated stuff, which is a lot more hectic, a lot more colorful, a lot louder, this might just be underwhelming. The Point is rated 7.5 on IMDb. Seems to be quite well liked. Most of these reviews probably are not from kids these days. In fact, you can look at an age breakdown of the ratings, and the movie is rated most highly among people who are 45 or older. This shouldn't really be a surprise. A lot of older movies are sort of skewed this way. But in particular, this is a movie that not only would people have just seen longer ago because, well, what am I trying to say here? Also, older people probably watched this movie as a kid, made a connection with that. These are ratings were not made IMDb was not around in 1971 for these ratings to have been created by parents at the time. These are kids who saw it then, people who were kids then. Jeez, it's a struggle. These are people who were kids then and have grown up. They have a special connection with that. That's not to undermine the goodwill towards this film. And I don't think this is a big case if you had to be there. There are some really lovely things about the Point. Once Oblio is banished, he heads out to the Pointless Forest along with his dog, Arrow, right? This is where the movie really starts to buck convention. Like I said, reminds me a bit of Alice in Wonderland. It flirts with nonsense. It flirts with pointlessness, and it flirts with the profound. There's something about childhood in that. And remember, the Count was afraid of this pointlessness, was afraid that there was some existential threat to pointlessness, right? But we can see, hey, look, a new, younger, hip generation is actually in tune with pointlessness or something like that. They are finding something meaningful here. And this, again, like I said, this movie a little bit reminds me of something like Yellow Submarine. I think speaks to which is Yellow Submarine 1968, I think is when that came out. So this, ties into a much more general sort of social upheaval, flirtation with the pointlessness, and some generational tension sort of around that. Anyway, Oblio and Arrow wander through the Pointless Forest and meet a cast of interesting characters. Most are sort of odd extensions of various American stereotypes. There's a jazz player, a businessman. These do have an ethnic tint to them, I think, with one being black and the other Jewish, presumably. Some of these sections are only loosely connected to the rest of the story, really. They depend a lot on music. At times it feels more like a string of music videos than anything else. I don't think this is a bad thing, though. The movie definitely drifts a little bit, but it's pleasant, and it taps into some fairly powerful images of nostalgia and youth. I don't want to step through every single episode here, but I'll just say that they have enough variety in message and in form to keep the movie going. They have some interesting ideas. We get some advice, some good, some not. We get some parody. We get some existential thoughts. It's pretty cool. What more could you want? Some people might be annoyed by the looseness of the story. This isn't a particularly dramatic movie, I guess, especially once Oblio sets out from the city. In some ways, his banishment is set up as this huge conflict. But Oblio actually doesn't seem that sad about it. His parents also don't seem that sad about it. Like I said, kind of oddly understated in some ways. He says his goodbyes and heads out. People are a bit downcast, but he just kind of gets on with it, and so do the citizens. And that's kind of interesting. This is not, his banishment is not hammed up as a tragedy, which is what some movies might do. That's kind of the only main conflict in the film, except for, Arrow being picked up by a bird or disappearing momentarily or something like that. And that big conflict actually ends up being resolved almost automatically after not that much time has really even passed. So like I said, not exactly dramatic, loose, but what a vibe. And that's kind of the main conclusion of the movie, honestly. Like I said, it's perhaps fitting, the origin of this film, Harry Nilsson tripping on acid. It's perhaps fitting of the time, a cool, kind of hip movie from the early 70s, something to show kids at the time, and something that a kid, something that I think would make a good, lasting impression on a kid, but also that would resonate for adults, something that taps into some real ideas and something that just kind of hints at some bigger ideas of the time. Like I said, some of this is sort of very straightforward kids movie ideas like inclusivity, right? Let's not exclude Oblio. Okay, there's a gazillion movies about inclusivity. What can we say about inclusivity? Yeah, the 60s people, okay, inclusivity, whatever. There's some things that are maybe a little bit deeper too, I guess, about, change, about people coping with outsiders, something like that. Okay, that's the point.